Hey guys, so last week at the end of the video we told you that we would push this car out of the sandblasting shed and we would introduce you to it. So we've done that, we've pushed it out, it's all sandblasted and painted mostly, and here it is. So yeah, this is my Porsche 924, it's a 1980 car, and about a year and a half ago I saved it from a scrap metal yard. We're now turning it into an absolute beast, basically. We're going to put a full carbon fibre body on it with a bit of a redesign of the body line and the style of the car, but we want to keep it narrow and keep it a 924. And we're putting a Volvo 5-cylinder turbo motor in it. We'll walk you through step by step everything we've done and everything we plan on doing. So probably the biggest change to the car that we're doing to the body is we've completely changed the body line. The original body line was a straight line, or almost a straight line from here to the front corner of the car. Well, what we decided was that it just didn't look right. It didn't flow well with the car, and they kept that line through its 20 years of production running. So what we've done is we've introduced what everyone calls a Coke bottle line into the car, where this line kicks up slightly over the rear wheels and dips through the door and then goes back up again over the front wheels before going into the front of the car. The reason we've done that is it flows with the body line that was already there. We only moved this line only slightly. We moved it up approximately 12 millimeters and we brought this whole panel out another 12 millimeters. So it's very subtle. So moving into the door section of the body line, the line was now coming down through this point and we kept that point the same. So we followed this line again and we brought it down through the door, and then we started to turn right when this line started to turn as well. And we brought it back up, flowing with this line through the same point, like this corner point on the door that was already there. So what we've done on this front fender, we've brought the line up again as it came through the door. It just naturally came up and dipped and came back into the headlight in the front of the car. But when we brought this line up, we felt like this bonnet and this line that the bonnet connects to the fender was just too low. So we actually brought this bonnet up about 6 millimeters, which is not much, but it's just made a ginormous difference to the shape of the bonnet. Here you can see the difference from side to side. What we've also done is replace the factory badge panel with a late style badge panel, and we did that for a few reasons, and one of them was an accident. The original badge panel was totally rusted out. It was just destroyed and unusable, so I needed a new one anyway, and my friend Paul Davies supplied me with two to choose from, an early style and a late style. And what I found when I put them both on is that the late style had a completely different shape. They put more curve through this line and this line, and it just looks amazing. It elongates the front of the car a lot. One of the goals for this project was to put 18-inch wheels on. We wanted to do that for a few reasons, but mainly to create a bit of theatre. We also wanted this 130mm ride height, as it just totally changes the stance of these cars. Having these big 18-inch wheels and lowering the ride height creates a few negative side effects which are difficult to overcome. This is our front bottom arm, and it should be parallel with the ground, and it's quite obviously not. We'll discuss our solution to this problem in a future episode. These are the wheels I've chosen for the car. They're an 18-inch 3-piece works wheel. They're exactly the style of wheel I wanted for the car, and I even really wanted bronze to begin with. And amazingly, I found these second-hand off of a Porsche 911 993. These wheels do stick out a little bit past the body of the car, and so to overcome that, we're going to make really subtle little arches to cover them. Matt's going to walk you guys through the carbon work.
So our goal of an 850 kilo fully laden car is very realistic. And we'll just talk you through a few parts of the car that can show you how we're planning on achieving it. For example, Hunter said that we are going to build these rear corners out of carbon. Once we've taken a mould off them, this whole steel panel here will get unstitched at the spot welds. thrown away, and then the new carbon fibre part will get put on there, and the actual weight of that carbon part will only be about 3 kilo. So you can see how you can very, very quickly reduce the weight dramatically. One of the other things we're doing on the car is we're not removing any of the structural parts of the car. For example, the rear chassis rails are going to stay. However, this whole steel boot floor and the whole inner spare wheel well is simply going to get taken out, and there's probably about 15 kilo of weight just in this floor and the spare wheel well. So removing that and bonding a new carbon structure in there will probably take about 12 kilo out just for that. The other advantage of taking the wheel well out is it means we can build a really effective underbody diffuser. This roof panel is the first carbon fibre part which we've finished, and we haven't bonded it on the car yet because we need to finish sandblasting and fit the roll cage. This is an example of what we're doing. So the original car obviously had a steel roof with the sunroof integrated into it, and we weighed all the components when we took it out, including the steel roof itself, and it was about 15 kilo. So this carbon fibre panel here is about 3. Well, okay, it's just under 3, it's 2.9.
When we removed the original roof, Matt took it apart at the spot welds, taking the original roof panel off without damaging the original steel flange. So when the new roof goes on, we can just drop it onto the steel flange with a glue joint in between the two. And that's how all modern cars are joined together. These cars had a transaxle, and the diff was in front of the transmission. So the diff was here and the transmission hung out the back here. And we're planning on replacing that transaxle with a Corvette transaxle, which is a different design. The differential is behind the transmission, so the diff sits here and the transmission sits in this space. So to fit that transaxle, we need to delete the rear seats, and in their place we're going to put the fuel tanks. This also has the benefit of moving the weight forward in the car, or centralizing the weight in the car, which is beneficial to weight distribution. Since we're putting the Corvette transaxle in there and the fuel tanks, we're taking out this steel panel and replacing it with carbon. We're also building a carbon fibre gearbox tunnel, but retaining the original floor.
To continue on just discussing our absolute mission of this 850 kilo target, one of the things we want to do with this car is put a half cage in it, and the downside to a half cage is they're heavy. Now, the way we're going to mitigate that is if we're going to continue the half cage through the floor pan of the car, and instead of using a rear suspension subframe, we're going to do away with that and mount the aluminium trailing arms off the bottom of that roll cage. So from our rough calculations, minusing the weight of the subframe, adding the weight of the half cage, we virtually at that point don't gain any weight. However, we gain a substantial amount of stiffness and safety to the car. One of the other considerations for taking away the rear subframe is that because we're running the Corvette transaxle, they kind of collide with each other. And the other thing is running 18-inch wheels and lowering the car to the height that we wanted just meant that the suspension arms were all in the wrong place anyway. It's a really advantageous thing to change the whole thing completely.
One of the other big changes to the car is we're going to move the whole driving position back in the car. One of the compromises of these cars was they were a 2+2, which means you need room in the back seat. And so since we're not having a back seat, we can move everything back, which means it's easier to get in and out of the car, and it will just feel more natural being in here. It also moves the weight back in the car. We're not just moving the seat back, we're going to be moving everything back. We'll be moving the steering wheel back and changing the steering column, and we'll be moving the pedal box back. And we've also changed this dashboard. The original dashboard in the 924 was very 70s Volkswagen. And in 1986, Porsche changed to this dashboard, which I think looks really, really sexy. And so it fits in the car because it's the same chassis. Because we're reducing all the flat areas on the car and we're adding more curves everywhere, this dashboard absolutely fits the bill for what we're trying to achieve. I really, really love the curve when you're looking through the windscreen at this line. I just think it's so organic. We will be modifying this dashboard slightly, and then we'll take a mold off of it and build one out of carbon fiber. So what we've been doing over the last few weeks is sandblasting and epoxy painting all of the parts of the car we're going to keep. So, for example, these floor pans we're going to keep, and the gearbox tunnel we're not. So that's why the gearbox tunnel is not painted and the floor is. So in the next few weeks, we'll put the car on the rotisserie, and we'll just go through and repair any damage that was caused by rocks or things from hitting the underbody, as they just need panel beating out. The car was actually galvanized from the factory, so it's in very, very good condition rust-wise. There was only a few points where there was rust.
So for those of you who already know me, you'll understand that one of my favourite jobs is cutting cars up with sabre saws and grinders. So a month or two ago we got the 5-cylinder engine, which we're planning on using, and dropped it in place and started cutting. The engine, before we took the firewall out, sat about here, and so what we've done is we've moved it back until the back of the engine is sitting just under the windscreen wiper cowling. And the rationale for that is simply to build the lightest and best handling car we possibly can. What the goal is to keep effectively every single part of the car that's heavy, so the engine, transmission, everything that's heavy between the two sets of axles. And the advantage of that is you get a car that handles very, very nicely. We'll go into it in a fair bit more detail later on, but what we're doing here is we're using the original cross-member subframe and welding basically bits of scrap metal on it in order to turn it into a jig. So the goal will be to remove this jig, and you can see how we've put some 2-inch blocks in here and up under here as well. So what we're going to do is, once we've removed the jig, we will cut these bits of the chassis out that are still green, and we'll put the jig back in, but 2 inches higher than it was. So we're basically keeping the lower arm geometry in the same location it is in the original car, but raising it up 2 inches, which effectively means that when the car's sitting at this new design ride height with those 18-inch wheels on, the bottom arms will be parallel with the ground, which is ultimately an ideal starting point for your suspension geometry. One of the only rusty parts of the whole car was around this battery box area. So one of our tasks, once we put the engine back in position and worked out the engine mounts, is to build a new firewall. The battery, which normally sits here, isn't going to sit here anymore. It will be mounted either on the floor in front of the passenger foot, or it'll be mounted somewhere in the back of the car. We'll let Hunter talk to you guys about exactly what motor this is and where he sourced it from and what he's planning on doing with it. But what I'll do is just explain how we're going to fit it in the car and the constraints we have. So the instant issue with this motor is it's a twin overhead cam, which is making it quite a lot taller than the original engine. It's also a 5-cylinder engine, which is longer. We haven't actually weighed the motor we pulled out of this, but we're fairly sure the motor is light. This motor is lighter than the original. We're going to find out in the next few weeks. So what we needed to do, the instant problem we have is the height. And when you measure the height of this from the bottom of the sump to fairly much the top, we get about 600 mil. So 600 mil, when you put it in and sit it on top of the cross member, is just simply too high. Now this isn't the piece of steel we're going to use, I'm just using it as a prop, but what we're going to do is mount the engine so the subframe in the car is going to sit here, which means that we can drop the bottom of the sump to the bottom of the subframe, so the subframe will still protect the engine, but the engine and the sump doesn't have to sit on top of the subframe. The engine itself is 600 mil long, and so if we place the back of the motor here, 600 mil forward from that is about here. And so you can see from where the crankshaft pulleys were that the actual sump will fit in here quite nicely. When we dropped the motor and had it sitting exactly where we're planning on having it, we also dropped the original bonnet back on it, and it does fit, but there's literally just touching the top of the oil fill. So effectively, once we get rid of this or lower it or change it, it means that the motor will just fit in the car. The other advantage of putting the engine all the way back in the car is the front axle line will be about here. So it's effectively a front mid-engine car.
So as Matt said, this is the actual engine we're going to use in the car. It's a Volvo 5-cylinder, which sounds like an old man motor. Originally I wanted an Audi motor for the car because the 924s originally had an Audi motor.
I thought they originally had a VW motor.
They're the same company.
Oh, right.
So yeah, they originally had an Audi VW motor, so putting another Audi VW 5-cylinder in was the perfect scenario. The problem with those Audi engines is there's none in New Zealand, basically, is the first problem. So I did look at importing one from the US, an 07K motor, but it was just too risky and I couldn't find any decent 07K engines. So then the other option was a TTRS engine from the new TTRSs and GT3s. Sorry, not GT3s, RS3s. But they're just stupidly expensive, like 25 grand, I think, for a stock motor. So that was out of my budget, out of the question. And then I stumbled across Volvos, and I didn't know much about Volvos at all. But they make 5-cylinders, and they made this 5-cylinder. So this is a B52, I can't remember the engine code, I'll put it in the description. It's their RNC engine, which is what it's commonly called in the Volvo forums. So it comes out of a 2005 Volvo V50, S40 or C30 coupe. And yeah, so they'd been building 5-cylinders for about 30 or 40 years before this one. And it's an all aluminium construction, dual overhead cam, turbocharged. It's a really good engine. So even though these engines come from a Volvo, Ford actually used these motors in their Ford Focus RS and STs. Some people have built these motors to over 1,000 horsepower. We're not going to do that. We're aiming for about 600 horsepower. And you can do that by putting the Ford Focus RS pistons and rods in. We don't exactly know what the plan is for building this engine, but we do know that we can build it with upgraded internals and a few other trick bits to being reliably 600 horsepower. And so that's the goal, and that's what we're going to push for.
What the overall aim for this car is to pretty much build the best car we possibly can. And what we're absolutely not doing is building a race car. It's not going to have rod ends or spherical joints anywhere. It's going to have proper rubber suspension. It's going to be very compliant on the road. Our aim is to build an absolute old school feel driving style car that just simply has way too much horsepower and is way too light. Part of our goal is to build, there's a few amazing car builders in Europe, for example, Alphaholics. The Retro Power guys are another one. Their cars, Alphaholics cars as well, are just absolutely stunning. and the desire to follow them in the perfection and the quality that they produce. However, we're doing it in a Porsche 924 platform is the goal of what this build is. So the interior will be beautifully finished, and there'll be leather, there'll be Alcantara, there'll be beautifully made and thoughtful parts. So I'll hand you over to Hunter for the outro now, but hopefully you guys have enjoyed this, and we'll see you next week.
So that's our basic overview of the car so far, and over the next, I'm not going to say year or so, because that's what Project Binky did and it went bad on them, but over the next year or so we're going to try and film the whole process of building this car from now on and show it to you guys. So if you're interested, subscribe and follow along for the journey.